Good morning, Cedric. Good morning,
Good
Becky.
morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Hey, Cedric, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. As Becky and I were considering how we could expand our implicit bias program to offer other perspectives, the name Cedric Ashley popped into my mind immediately. You see, not only is Cedric the first African American editor in chief of the award winning GP Solo magazine published by the American Bar Association, but he's also served as both diversity director and chair of the diversity board of the Solo Small Firm and General Practice Division of the ABA. And on top of that, he served a 2-year term as chair of the New Jersey State Bar Diversity Committee. Oh, indeed, a wealth of experience in addition to running a busy law practice for the past 30 years. But let's turn to the topic of the day, implicit bias.
So, Cedric, I just wanted to start out by asking you if you can give us an example or a scenario of what implicit bias in action might look like.
Sure. An example could be, let's say there's an older male attorney working who grew up in an environment and in a time period and a community where women worked from home. And in his era, it wasn't even work from home. They were homemakers. It wasn't even work. And that's how he grew up. And that's how maybe his life unfolded. And without really knowing it in his workplace, he's tending to assign the more significant projects or projects that may work into the later hours or the weekends without knowing it. It's just automatically there's this default assigning it to men, men who are either single or men who are married. And he doesn't, it's not necessarily conscious. That's why it's implicit unconscious bias. He doesn't necessarily know that he's intentionally preventing women from having these opportunities. It's just sort of that environmentally nurtured, hardwired way of how he does things. And until somebody brings it to his attention, it may continue on. So that's just one example of implicit bias.
That's really helpful. And I know you've discussed discrimination in terms of kind of a continuum. Can you talk a little bit more about that and tell us how implicit bias fits into that discussion?
Sure. And this is sort of my perspective. I haven't necessarily looked at any research on it, but I just, implicit bias or unconscious bias is something that you're not aware of that's operating almost like it's almost like malware operating within an OS system or an operating system. And it's just going on in the background, this sort of routine. This is just how things are versus, outward declaration of I am biased, I am prejudiced, and I bring those biases and prejudices to bear to the forefront in my decision making, in my hiring, in my treatment of others, in my whatever the capacity could be. So it's almost as though it's a not even aware state, which maybe even probably even less than like a negligent state, because with negligence there's a duty and you don't meet that level of the duty. And then on the whole other spectrum of purposeful conduct, you are purposefully intending to bring about a particular result. So if we looked at it along that kind of spectrum, implicit bias or unconscious bias falls definitely along the spectrum of that lower level unawares operating in the background versus the intentional awareness and intentionally bring it to the forefront and acting upon it. And we all harbor some level of implicit bias uh, to some degree or to some category. That's just how life is.
And there's so much more implicit bias, at least from what I've seen, than the actual explicit bias, at least in this day and age, that I think implicit bias can be difficult to deal with. So if I'm a victim of implicit bias, what can I do on the spot?
Yeah, I think that everyone is going to operate differently how they will respond to it. But one thing is beginning to engage in conversations that are hopefully factual in nature, that doesn't put feelings aside, but are factual in nature. So to the extent that it may begin with a dialogue. Hey, person, hey, coworker, hey, boss, hey, leader, hey, supervisor. I realize that, I'm not being assigned X, Y, and Z assignments, and I'm continually not being assigned X, Y, and Z assignments. Can you tell me how or what the decision-making process is to give out these assignments? And that's at the beginning conversations. I mean, so it doesn't have to be an attack. It just begin to explore. How do you get to the process? It may turn out that, there's a rational basis for it, and it may be having a disparate impact upon somebody. Or maybe, I never really thought about how I was assigning these. I didn't really give any thought. So maybe I need to come up with a metric. So I think the easiest thing to do is begin to have a conversation, and you have to empower yourself. Like the days of, okay, I'm just going to, depending on the situation, everyone's different, but I would encourage people to engage in conversations when something is occurring that they need to sort of get a grasp of why is this particular thing occurring.
And dovetailing off of that, what can we really do as allies if we see this happening to someone else, maybe a colleague or?
Same thing. We'll first get a sense from the person, how they do or don't want you to intervene. Speak to the person, recognize that, hey, I see this is also going on, support them. And if you need to be an independent sort of witness or a person who can say, verify, yeah, I do realize that, even if you're the one receiving the prime assignments, continuing with this example, it's better like, yeah, I do recognize I am getting X, Y, and Z cases, X, Y, and Z assignments. And I see that this person is not, we're of equal years, we're of equal experience, equal background. And it would be helpful to know how these assignments are handed out. So I think everyone potentially thinks that, doesn't think, but there's not necessarily a need to be attacking anyone until there's a need to attack someone. And even then you don't have to attack somebody, but it's a need to find out what is going on. Like you really can't make determinations until you really know what's going on. So it's trying to get a sense of what's going on here. This is what I'm seeing. I don't want it to be what I'm assessing. I don't want it to be my opinions. I don't want it to be my judgments. I don't want it to be my interpretations. I just want to know factually what is the basis for this, so then I can begin to make those assessments, those opinions, and those judgments.
Well, now, earlier in the presentation or in our interview, you pointed out that all of us harbor implicit bias of one type or another, and that must include me. So help us. So I've heard you discuss the concept of BLT. So what is it and how can it apply here?
So right, so BLT, I author a column, with a column I author for the ABA GP Solo magazine, all relates to well-being, resilience, emotional intelligence, meaningfulness. And BLT stands for Balanced Life Theory. It also is a play on the word BLT, bacon, lettuce, tomato. If I were making a BLT, it would be beef bacon, Roma tomatoes, and maybe some focaccia bread, but that's just the chef in me. Definitely not the traditional BLT. But I believe in and I'm passionate about just all into balanced life and well-being and resilience, and to the extent that there is in my mind this intersectionality between well-being and issues of implicit bias or diversity, equity, inclusion, because as a community, I mean, if one of us is not whole, or if we're not feeling well, emotionally or mentally, or don't feel that we're operating within a safe space, then ultimately the overall community, whether it's the workplace community, whether it's a neighborhood, whether it's a city, won't be able to operate at their optimal level. So all of this, whether it's racial justice, gender justice, transgender justice, immigration justice, all of these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion operate also in my opinion, within the space of well-being, individual well-being, organizational well-being, community well-being. And addressing these issues of implicit bias and unconscious bias goes directly to the well-being of individuals and organizations and teams.
We're completely on the same page, and this is really powerful information. And so is this the kind of work that you do with your clients at Sedashco?
So I've been sort of in the lawn and sort of transitioning a slow transition out of the law for a good number of years. And 2021, probably with some impact of COVID, where we're approaching 500,000 people deceased in this country, and you really got to take stock of what are you doing, what are you passionate about, what's meaningful to you. So I'm beginning to venture more into coaching and training in the areas of well-being, resilience, meaningfulness, as well as diversity, equity, inclusion. And Sadashco, sort of, that's my first first three letters, Sed and Ashco, sort of my little personal company to do my business under. But there are some brands with lawyering I do it under Beyond Lawyering, because it's about going beyond lawyering to those competencies, relational, conversational, emotional competencies beyond the functional and technical competencies that get us in the door as a lawyer, that I hope to develop or help attorneys develop in individuals and teams and organizations to live more fulfilled lives and have more fulfilled careers. And it's kind of stuff I like, and it's stuff I write about and speak about, and just I love it.
Well, thank you so much, Cedric. Is there anything else that you would like to add as a final takeaway or advice for us today?
I would just say that it's important to have these necessary, I call them necessary, messy, difficult, yet courageous conversations around implicit bias, unconscious bias, and the work around diversity, equity, inclusion. Everything starts with conversations, talking to people who are similar to you, talking to people who are different from you. And that's the first step. One of the first steps is having conversations. And I would say maybe that's step two. Step one is becoming more self-aware, taking a self-inventory of who you are, beginning to question the stories that you have, the stories that you've been told, the stories you hold on to, what you believe is the truth or true, and just beginning to step away and peel that back a little bit to see that probably a lot of those beliefs are judgments and opinions, not based in any fact whatsoever. And the more we can free ourselves from those, the better we'll be, and the more we'll be able to interact with others about, like I said, these necessary, messy, but difficult and courageous conversations.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and we thank you so much, Cedric, for sharing your perspective with our audience today. You've certainly left us with a lot to think about and do. And this is Cedric Ashley, principal of Sedashco.
Thank you. It's great being here.